What's up guys, it's me Jeremy. YASUO was released on December 13th in 2013 and was designed by Riot Certainly T. Now Certainly T might just be the most disliked champion designer at Riot, since he does tend to create a lot of imbalanced champions that people hate to play against, but personally I am really fond of his champion design style. He really tries all sorts of crazy abilities and wacky ideas on the off chance that they might work, and YASUO is one of the creations that came to life out of that style. However, YASUO wasn't always going to end up in the way that he did, and he went through a ton of different iterations and versions that could have actually made it into the live release. So join me today in taking a look back through YASUO's development cycle to find out what YASUO could have been. And if you guys enjoyed this video, hit that like button, and if you don't, hit that dislike, because if this video hits 10,000 ratings, you guys know what's up by now, I'm buying myself a pizza. Anyways, let's get started. YASUO's development story begins with the theme for his character. Certainly T had this concept that he wanted to bring to life of a character that would be a more traditional and very serious and intense swordsman. He liked Master Yi a lot, but felt that there was room in the game for a different type of swordsman to exist. And he stumbled upon this idea of capturing this tone of the type of character from, you know, like a classic samurai movie, where the samurai is just so melancholic and brutal and just dark and intense. The kind of guy that just faces a bunch of enemies and comes out drenched in blood with like 30 corpses behind him, and fights not because he wants to, but because it's his duty. And that was the design fantasy that YASUO began with. And after they had the initial idea, they would go on to expand a bit on the concept, and in fleshing out that idea about a samurai swordsman type, they broke it down into 3 parts that they felt captured the personality of the combat style quite well. Those parts ended up being dash, parry, and strike. From there, it was obvious that YASUO's abilities in his gameplay would have to capture the feel and essence of those 3 elements. After that, YASUO's character was actually quite fleshed out. Since his design did start with his theme in the first place, they already kind of knew the core of his character and personality and what it was going to be, so it didn't really go through as many iterations as some of the other champions we've looked at, since the designers kind of knew what they wanted from the start. However, his actual gameplay kit is a much different story, as the vast majority of YASUO's development time was spent on developing his gameplay and making it work, and as a result it went through a massive number of changes. This development began with YASUO's dash and YASUO's strike abilities. One of the first variations of YASUO's dash that was playtested was actually put on his ultimate. This old ultimate was a dash that would be kind of a line skill shot that stunned and damaged all enemies hit. It was kind of like how the classic move of a samurai in a movie does this super epic and fast dash past an enemy where, you know, they unsheath their sword and then everyone in the way just gets chopped in half. It was totally just super cool as a concept for an ultimate, and it did an awesome job of capturing the intense samurai feel that they were trying to go with. But eventually they decided that it would probably be best for his dash to not actually be on his ultimate, because that kind of made his dash feel as if it wasn't actually a core part of his kit, which they wanted to. And from there, the version of that dash was actually toned down a lot to be super short ranged, and they wanted it to feel elegant and more intense. So they came up with the idea of being able to use it on minions and dash just all over the place, and the team decided that that version of the dash was actually extremely fun to play with. So they kept it, and after a few minor tweaks and stuff, it would become his E. At this point in his development, they realized that in order for him to feel good to play, his ultimate would have to be probably a separate effect outside of the dash, parry, and strike elements, since those 3 things were just so core to bringing Yasuo's personality to life through his gameplay that they couldn't be gated on an ability that had a really long cooldown. Instead, they decided that they wanted to give him some kind of super synergy with certain types of champions, because a lot of melee carries in the game kind of lacked a very holistic synergy, and that was an interesting element of gameplay that they wanted to explore. And as a result, they settled upon the idea of an ultimate that complements the knockup to extend the duration and give him this crazy epic and satisfying wombo combo kind of feel with a really awesome moment of gameplay. As for his strike ability, it went through a couple more iterations. It started out as kind of like an angled slash crescent strike ability that would strike one way and then the other and then strike again a 3rd time down the middle. This idea of 3 strikes was pretty cool and it was definitely fun to play with, but it proved to be probably too insane, so they decided to separate the triple slash ability into 3 separate slashes that all interacted differently. Another iteration was a slash ability that was specific to each hand. Sometimes it would slash from his left hand in an arc, and sometimes it would slash from like his right hand in an arc. Think of something like a Diana Crescent Strike kind of that could also come from his left side as well as his right side, and the side that it came from took place at random. And this version was scrapped because it turned out that actually none of the playtesters could figure out how to use it effectively since it was random, and because it just was annoying to play with, honestly. And as well, the handed kind of thing was actually kind of pointless if you were actually skilled with him, since you could always just turn around instantly to get the right angle based on which side you were throwing it from, since the turn time for a character model in League of Legends, you know, it's instant. You just click on whatever side of your character. And as a result, that ability didn't really make sense to put on his kit. Eventually they came back to the idea of the 3 strike ability, since that ability was super fun to play with, but since it was kind of a bit too strong, they wanted to keep the concept but tone it down a little bit. And they came up with the idea of just a single strike, where you would instead store a charge, and on the 3rd strike, you do some kind of extra bonus effect. Originally, this extra bonus effect on the 3rd hit did not actually have a knockup on it, but after seeing how satisfying his ultimate was to land on a target and work with, it became clear that making him rely on an ally for knockups entirely just wasn't realistic, and they gave the knockup to the 3rd hit on the strike, and they felt that was a good place to put it. As well, they really liked the concept of how critical strikes went along with his theme of being this swift and elegant samurai, and they incorporated that into his strike ability as well, and they also liked the idea of giving him double crit chance since it made a lot of sense with his theme, and was a pretty cool way for him to have crit chance become a much more meaningful stat within his gameplay. After they had his dash and his strike elements in place, they began the long process of developing YASUO's parry. His dash and strike fell into place quite easy actually, as those elements of gameplay were simple to make really satisfying to play with and make sense thematically. However, developing a parry kind of effect for a melee carry proved to be a lot more complex. In the beginning, they attempted to simply give YASUO some just strong basic defensive tools. In one of the very first iterations of YASUO, this parry element of gameplay existed on his passive actually, in the form of a much more proactive shield. This passive would give him a small shield every single time he cast a spell with no cooldown. The shield only lasted for half a second, but since all of his abilities had an extremely low cooldown to give him a very fast and complex style of gameplay, it became the case where if you were fighting someone in a 1v1 or just trading in lane, his health bar would almost never move actually, since you would just get an insane amount of shields from casting so many damn spells. It was like having the old Poppy passive on steroids almost, and it felt super frustrating to play against, and as a result it was scrapped. Meanwhile, Certainly T had been fiddling around with this idea of blocking projectiles for quite some time actually. He had playtested it a lot on previous champions, and he knew that it was a super cool effect and was totally awesome enough to where it would almost certainly make it into League of Legends eventually. It was just tough to find the right kind of champion for it. One of his original designs for Darius actually included an ability that allowed Darius to swing his axe in a targeted direction, knocking enemies aside, but also destroying all missiles that happened to be in the way. So this wind wall kind of effect actually could have existed on Darius, but they decided that it didn't really make much sense in Darius's kit thematically, and it didn't really fit in that well with the rest of his gameplay either, so it was scrapped in the meantime. Fast forward about a year later, and the design team was messing around with the concept of blocking projectiles once again, and they looked towards the LCS pros actually to get some opinions on what type of champion they might like to see that type of ability on. Most of the pros suggested putting this ability on a support, but it was actually Hotshot GG himself who recommended putting it on a melee AD carry, and the design team liked that idea from Hotshot quite a bit, and they decided to try it out as a version of the parry element for YASUO. And then Certainly T came up with the idea for being able to just place down a wall that blocked projectiles rather than a reactionary kind of ability with Darius that just swatted them out of the air. For a long time, it was quite controversial actually. This mechanic was this new and scary thing that they wanted to bring into the game, and as a result, it proved to be quite the hard sell for the designers to push through. That wind wall also did go through a couple different versions too, and potentially could have ended up being a lot different. Originally, the Yasuo wind wall would let explosive skills detonate when it hit the wind wall, so something like Karma's Q, instead of just straight up disappearing, would explode at the wall as if it had actually hit something, and if there was someone close enough to the radius, they would of course take the damage and get slowed like they got hit normally. And this variation actually felt really bad to play with as the Yasuo player, since it kind of removed his ability to block those spells almost completely. And it also created a lot of gameplay moments where Yasuo accidentally killed his ally by changing where the skill shot exploded at, causing your ally to get hit by it. And that chance to backfire was something that was just straight up unacceptable for this type of ability, since they were already struggling so hard to make it feel fun to play with. So even though it felt a lot better to play against, they had no choice but to just change it. Another one of Yasuo's designs for the original wind wall allowed him to place it at a targeted point anywhere within 1,000 units of him. It was a point and click where you could just place it down, but it ended up being a bit too versatile and difficult to outplay because the range on it was so high that it just gave you so much more options. So they decided to confide it to being a set melee range ability, as that made a lot more sense thematically, as well as being sort of this, short-ranged samurai that is just swift and intense. Alright, let's talk a bit about the design of the Yasuo wind wall. Whenever you try to create a new and scary mechanic, it really comes down to two things. First off, how fun is it to play with? If it's super fun, that usually makes the second part, which is how difficult or how fair is it to play against, a lot more lenient. And at first they were actually really skeptical about being able to put this kind of ability on a champion, because they weren't actually sure how fun it was to play with, while it was almost certainly going to be frustrating to play against no matter in what form. But in a playtest with Riot Gypsy Lord playing Lucian and Riot Morello playing Yasuo, there was a moment where Lucian used his ultimate and then Yasuo just blocked the entire thing with his wind wall, and they realized that it was actually a super awesome moment, and it was when they finally realized that yes, the wind wall was a super awesome thing, and it was fun and cool to use, and it did have a place in his kit. And in order to combat the second point of making it more fair to play against, they gave it the set unchangeable range that allowed you to outplay it through your positioning, and that also comboed with the mind game of trying to bait it out, and they finally settled upon the current version of the wind wall that exists now that was fun to play with, but also reasonably more fair to play against. And actually coding the wind wall was also an incredibly difficult task. I mean, they started with a prototype that would just straight up track all missiles on the map and just track their locations relative to the wind wall, and if they connected, it would just remove them from the game, but that ended up being super taxing on the server, and as a result it would make some of the super fast projectiles sneak through a lot of the time. Eventually they came up with the design that whenever a missile enters the wind wall, it spawns a new missile that rapidly moves towards an invisible minion, and when that minion is hit by the new missile, the original missile that connected with the wind wall is destroyed. So that's a little insight as to how Yasuo's wind wall is coded, and it is actually quite literally coded as minions. And with all that put together, the only thing left was his passive. Yasuo was actually resourceless for almost all of his development, but they felt that maybe he needed a little bit more skirmishing power, as he was still a little bit too vulnerable since Windwall did have a super long cooldown. So they came back to one of the original ideas of the shield, and in order to make it feel a little bit more impactful, they gave it kind of like a static shiv effect of having it build up and then finally proc for a nice little shield, rather than some really small shields consistently. And they used flow to showcase that and communicate the shield effect in a reasonable way to opponents, so that it wasn't just coming out of nowhere and was a little bit more healthy design. And with all that, a couple more minor tweaks and fixes, and Yasuo's gameplay kit had been complete, and his theme of being this intense samurai had been captured quite well. There's actually a time when the designers expected him to be playable in every single role except for support. And it's funny how a lot of the abilities that Yasuo ended up with are really just a super toned down version of the original crazy idea, but that's a lot of how Certainly T's design style works for champions, and it's kind of why I like him a lot. He's really good at coming up with fun concepts for gameplay. He just might not be the best at making them fair on the initial design, so it ends up resulting in a lot of toning down, but often keeping the original gameplay concepts intact, and we can definitely see that a lot with Yasuo. Yasuo ended up being, honestly, an incredible piece of work design-wise. The mechanics and complexity and depth that have gone into this character have resulted in one of the most interesting and unique champions to exist in League of Legends, and I, for one, now that the kinks have been ironed out and the balance issues dealt with, see Yasuo as a true just work of art and a masterpiece of a champion that really also helped pioneer the new standard of Riot's champion designers. Although a lot of the variations of YASUO during his development were equally as awesome, there's no doubt that YASUO is a pretty sweet champion right now. And that's going to be it for me today. Thank you so much for watching, everybody. Subscribe if you want, and I'll see you guys next time.